She was born far away from the streets where her destiny would one day unfold. Her childhood passed by the restless ocean that breathed steadily at night like a living creature. The wind carried the scent of salt and grass, and that scent could not be mistaken for any other. Even then, she often looked into the distance and felt that beyond the horizon another life was waiting. In her lived an unquiet longing for the road and for an attempt to understand how the greater world worked, a world where cities spoke in many languages and every sunrise brought new answers. Youth carried her to a wide, hot land where the sun burned the ground generously and the light clung to the evenings for a long time. She quickly adjusted to that reality. She learned to work hard and to appreciate the simple smells of food and clean laundry. Yet the feeling of confinement never left her. She imagined that on the far side of the planet something greater was happening, that there the heart of time was beating, and if she could go there, she would hear its steps. She grew into someone attentive and determined. At first, she liked to care for people. She mastered useful skills and did not fear days filled to the brim with work. But at night, when she closed her eyes, she saw again maps, lines of roads, names of faraway cities. She carefully set aside each modest coin. She learned new words, repeating them in whispers until memory accepted them as her own. One day the decision ripened. She chose the path across the ocean to old Europe, to its stations, cobblestones, and squares. Paris greeted her with soft morning light and the smell of coffee spilling out onto the streets through narrow doors. The city rooted itself in her through countless details. Wet traces on cobblestones after a night rain, the movement of trams, the chairs of small cafes where one could sit by the window and watch people hurry by. She walked and listened to the sound of steps, as if she were reading a new book whose every page smelled of fresh ink. She felt that she had entered a long-awaited space where she could become herself. She fell in love. The man was attentive. He smiled calmly. He knew how to wait and how to listen. With him came the feeling of a gentle home where one could dust a windowsill, place wildflowers in a vase, and live unhurried. She let into her heart the language of his country. She learned to speak softly and clearly. She learned to hear intonations and pauses. So little by little, France became not just a place on the map, but an inner space where she could breathe fully. But clouds darkened on the horizon. People spoke of a coming storm. Troubled words sounded more often in conversations. On squares, speeches and marches were discussed. On the pages of newspapers, notes multiplied about a force growing in the east. In the air, there was a tension that at first felt like a faint chill under the heart, and then became obvious and foreign. When war began, the world tilted. The city changed. There were checkpoints and alien footsteps. Columns in gray uniforms marched through the streets, and in that march was a rhythm not their own. She saw how people lowered their eyes, how conversations ceased when patrols appeared. That was when a swift growing up began. Life had taught her not to lose presence of mind, but now another strength was needed, not outer firmness, but an inner endurance like a steel rod hidden inside a soft cover. At first, she helped as any compassionate person could. Deliver a letter, carry a small bundle, escort someone to the right door, and then vanish in the crowd. Upon these small deeds, fates depended, and the sad knowledge of that only sharpened her sense of duty. Her hands trembled when patrols passed close by. Her heart beat so loudly it seemed ready to betray her. Yet she learned to breathe evenly, not to rush, not to scan with restless eyes, not to leave unnecessary traces. She understood quickly that in this struggle her past had no weight, neither the distant island nor the hot land of youth, nor her old habits. Here, on this ground, she had made a new choice, and it demanded a whole self. She needed to learn the right pace for days where danger waited in every corner. She had to know how to keep her face steady, how not to betray her true aim with trembling eyelids, how to speak in plain phrases that revealed nothing more. Each day the burden grew heavier. She saw sealed doors and empty rooms. She heard how neighbors disappeared, small shops closed and never reopened. At familiar crossroads the usual noise faded, and at certain walls the sound of boots at night grew louder. She knew there was no more time to wait. Thoughts of fairness were replaced with the clear knowledge of necessity. She could appear to be the sort of woman expected in peacetime. A light smile, a dress fitting perfectly, smooth hair, familiar gestures. This was not a mask. It was part of her true self, an ability to be light and bright. But now to that lightness was added a steel discipline. With the right people, she spoke quickly and precisely. In needless conversations, she remained blank and forgettable. She found paths where the eyes of patrols slid away. She learned to decide in a second and to leave if her inner sense gave warning. She continued to love the city even as it began to resemble a sick body. She loved the smell of morning bread that still escaped through closed shutters. She loved the hush of old courtyards where at noon one could hear water flowing. She loved rare singing in a yard when someone forgot sorrow for a moment. That love for a place that had become her second home made her steps firm. She did not want to remain only an observer. She chose to be one who acted. Thus, little by little, a new role settled into her life. A messenger, a link, a hidden path between those who risked everything and those who needed saving. She felt out those trails carefully, like a person walking at night without a lantern. She was taught to look at neighborhoods with the eyes of a guide, to see hiding spots where an ordinary passerby saw only a wall, to remember safe routes, to measure how the time of day changed the behavior of streets. Evenings. She returned home and sat long in silence. Inside her, attention grew like a thin string. One slight touch, and the string could sound a sharp note. But she held balance. She reinforced in herself the habit of small steps. One contact, another route, another delivery, and again, steady breathing. Her life stretched in two directions. Outward, she remained the same soft surface that was easy to believe. Inward, she carried resolve. In this strange union of softness and firmness, her strength showed. She did not try to be a hero. She simply made a choice and stepped where fear must be tamed. The memory of the far shore never faded. At times she recalled the dark ocean. She heard the low roar of waves, and it reminded her that the world was greater than any grief. With that thought, she rose each morning and walked on. The city needed brave hands, and destiny had already opened the door into a path from which there was no turning back. She did not know that ahead lay trials that could break even the strongest. She did not know how many doors she would open and how many she would close forever. But already then she had learned the essential truth. In the needed hour not to lose a simple human smile, not to collapse into rage, not to allow fear to command her hands. That discipline of the soul becomes armor when around her the dark noise rises. So ended her peaceful introduction to adulthood and began a new chapter where every motion had a price, every word demanded accuracy, and every path had to lead not to empty hope, but to real salvation. She was not yet known to anyone, but she had already become who she was meant to be. A person who came from far away but loved her new land so deeply that she could rebuild her inner world for it and take responsibility for the fates of others as for her own. Marseille in peacetime was a city where the smell of the sea mingled with the voices of street vendors, where on the squares children laughed and in the cafes people argued over politics and theater. It lived as every port lives, noisy and open with a mixture of languages, temperaments, and customs. Nancy felt in this city a special energy, as if each street were an artery through which life itself flowed without ever stopping. She quickly grew to love this rhythm and found in it her own corner where she could feel herself a part of the greater world. But with the arrival of war, that rhythm changed. Instead of the usual noise of the ports and the markets, there was now unease hanging in the air. People spoke in whispers, and the familiar smiles became rare. On the streets there appeared more and more foreign faces in uniform. Their steps were measured and confident, and in those steps was the sound of cold calculation. Marseille, once bright and free, became a place where each day could turn to a trap. Nancy looked at what was happening with inner protest. She could not accept that people she knew now had to lower their eyes and step aside for soldiers who considered the city their prize. Most terrifying were the arrests. One day blurred into another. In the morning, someone still went to the market, and in the evening, his house stood empty. Seals hung on the doors, and neighbors whispered about where the family had been taken. She fought with herself for a long time. Inside her, there was the desire to act, but along with it, there was fear. Fear for herself, for her husband, for the few friends that remained near. She understood that a single wrong step could cost her life. Yet each time she saw humiliation on the street, each time she heard a cry in the distance or noticed the frightened eyes of a child, something flared up inside her. That fire would not let her sleep. Her first steps were small errands. Acquaintances who had ties to the underground asked her to carry a letter or deliver a small package. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary in it. Just paper, just a few pages. But Nancy knew that inside there were not words for reading, but life itself for those who hoped for help. Each time she stepped out with such a burden, she felt her heart beating too loudly. She walked calmly, tried not to draw attention, acted as if her stroll were an ordinary one. Yet under the calm exterior a storm raged. She knew that if anyone stopped her and looked inside the bag, everything would be over. But she did not turn back. Little by little, the tasks became more difficult. She was asked to guide people, to help them leave the city, to find a road to the place where someone was waiting for them. She learned to read glances. Where an ordinary person saw just a passer-by, she noticed a sign, a barely perceptible gesture, a look that said more than words. Thus, an invisible network formed, and she became part of it. One day she was asked to lead a woman with a small child. They walked through the narrow streets of Marseille, and every step felt like an eternity. Soldiers stood at the intersections, and cars drove past slowly. The child began to cry softly, and Nancy's heart clenched. She bent down, murmured something gentle, took his hand, and led him forward. At that moment it seemed to her that if anyone blocked the way, she would walk through without hesitation. They reached the destination, and the woman, clutching Nancy's hands, wept without words. Each such trial left its mark. She returned home and sat long in silence. Her husband asked if she were tired, and she answered that all was well. But inside her grew the awareness that she had already crossed the line. There was no return to the former quiet life. She had chosen a path where life itself was at stake. Marseille was becoming ever more dangerous. The Gestapo worked without rest, hunting those who resisted. People were taken at night. Neighbors tried not to meet one another's eyes, fearing that even a glance could be betrayal. Nancy knew that her name might appear on a list at any moment, but that did not stop her. On the contrary, with every passing day, her resolve only strengthened. They began to call her the White Mouse. She learned of it later from those who had overheard conversations. The nickname came from the way she always slipped away, as if she knew every exit and every passage in the city. The name became a symbol. While they could not catch her, she could continue to help. While she remained free, she was hope for those who had almost none left. In the first years of occupation, Nancy walked the path from an ordinary woman who only wanted to live to someone willing to risk with every step. In her still lived the lightness and love for life she had always had, but now they were joined with a strength she had not known before. She saw too much pain around her to remain aside. She was not French by blood, but she became French in spirit. Her choice defined everything that would happen next. The choice between safety and struggle, and she chose struggle. The city that once gave her a sense of belonging now turned into a place of endless shadows. Nancy had grown used to fear. She had trained her mind to control the trembling of her hands. She had learned to walk with steady steps, even when her heart beat wildly inside her chest. But nothing prepared her for the day when her life was torn apart in a way that would mark her forever. Her husband had been her anchor. In his presence, she felt that there still existed a world of warmth and trust, a world where two people could share small daily joys. He supported her without demanding explanations. When she returned late at night, he asked nothing. When he noticed the weariness in her face, he simply touched her hand, and in that touch, she found enough strength to continue. Their home in Marseille, though threatened by the storms of war, remained a sanctuary where for a few moments she could breathe freely. But the net of the occupiers tightened. The Gestapo was relentless. They watched, they listened, they created lists that grew longer with each passing week. Rumors spread that underground networks had been infiltrated. Neighbors whispered in fear, certain that informants moved among them. Nancy knew danger was everywhere, but she believed that their quiet precautions would be enough. She believed that if she was careful, she could shield her husband from suspicion. One evening, the pounding on the door shattered that fragile belief. Boots echoed in the stairwell, and voices shouted commands. The sound of fists against wood carried the certainty of doom. Nancy's heart froze as men in uniform pushed into the room, their eyes cold and searching. They tore through drawers, opened cupboards, scattered papers across the floor. Her husband was pulled aside, questioned with sharp, accusatory words. She tried to remain calm, to appear as nothing more than an ordinary woman, but she knew it was useless. The occupiers had decided their fate long before entering. They dragged him away. The last image she carried was his glance toward her, steady and silent, as if to say she must hold on. She reached for him, but was pushed back. The door slammed shut, leaving her in the hollow silence of a house that no longer felt like home. Hours passed, then days, but he never returned. The news came slowly, through whispers carried by those who had seen, those who dared to risk a word. He had been tortured. He had refused to betray. His strength had been his final gift to her, but it cost him his life. Nancy walked through the streets with this knowledge burning in her chest, every sound around her muffled by grief. She felt as if the world had lost its shape. The man who had been her partner, her protection, her anchor, was gone, and she was left standing in the ruins of her former life. For a time she drifted like a shadow. Food lost its taste. Sleep refused to come. At night she sat by the window listening to the hum of the city, imagining his voice in the darkness. She remembered the way he would smile when she entered the room, the way he would pour wine into 2 glasses as if they had all the time in the world. Now those memories cut deeper than any wound. But grief did not break her. It transformed her. Where once she had acted cautiously, hesitating at the edge of risk, now there was no room for fear. They had already taken what was most precious to her. She had nothing more to lose, and that truth made her resolve unshakable. She turned her sorrow into fire. The woman who had once carried messages quietly, blending into the crowd, now sought out greater dangers. She demanded assignments that placed her directly against the enemy. She trained herself to handle weapons, to sabotage railways, to lead others through forests and mountains. The death of her husband became the dividing line in her life. On one side was the quiet helper, the woman who still believed in the possibility of safety. On the other side was the fighter, hardened by loss, unwilling to bow. Those who knew her noticed the change. Her gaze grew sharper. Her voice, though still soft when needed, carried an undercurrent of iron. She moved through the city with the same grace as before, but behind that grace was the will of someone who had stared into the abyss and chosen to continue. The Gestapo increased their efforts to catch her, raising the price on her head to sums spoken of in hushed awe. Yet she slipped through their hands again and again, as if guided by destiny itself. She no longer measured days by hours or meals, but by the lives she could save and the damage she could inflict on the occupiers. Bridges blown, supply lines cut, prisoners freed. Each act carried risk of capture and death, but to her these dangers had become secondary. The fear that once threatened to paralyze her had been burned away by grief. All that remained was clarity. She would fight, and she would not stop until victory or death. In those dark years, she became legend. The name White Mouse spread further, whispered not only by enemies who hunted her, but also by allies who took courage from her survival. Mothers told their children that somewhere in the night walked a woman who outwitted the enemy at every turn. Fighters in the hills looked to her for guidance, following her into battles that seemed impossible. Yet, beneath the legend, she remained human. Alone at night, she still touched the pillow where her husband once lay. She still whispered his name in silence, carrying him with her in every choice she made. His death was the wound that never closed, but it was also the source of her relentless strength. The price of resistance had been unbearable, but from that loss emerged the unbreakable figure she would forever be remembered as. Nancy understood that freedom demanded sacrifice. Her life had been split apart, yet in that breaking she had discovered her truest self. From then on, she was not merely a woman caught in the storm of history. She was the storm itself. The nickname came quietly at first, whispered by those who hunted her and repeated with awe by those who followed her example, the White Mouse. It sounded almost playful, a creature small and fragile, yet impossible to trap. The name spread across Marseille and beyond, carried in secret reports, in coded messages, in fearful conversations overheard in taverns. For the Gestapo, the White Mouse became an obsession. For the people she defended, the name became a symbol of defiance. Nancy knew nothing of it in the beginning. She was too busy surviving, too focused on the tasks placed in her hands. But the whispers grew louder. Allies began to call her by the name with quiet smiles, as if it carried luck. Enemies spat it with frustration, cursing the phantom woman who escaped again and again. In the strange theater of occupation, she became both legend and target, a ghost who haunted the occupying army. The Gestapo dedicated whole teams to her capture. They tracked her movements with maps pinned to the walls of their offices. They interrogated prisoners, demanding names, pressing for descriptions. They knew she was a woman, foreign by origin, moving with skill through the networks of the underground. Yet each time they drew near, she slipped away. A planned arrest ended with an empty house. A raid revealed only false papers and abandoned clothes. She seemed to vanish into the very air of the city, leaving behind nothing but confusion. Stories began to circulate among the population. Some swore she could change her appearance in an instant, passing as a merchant's wife one day and a nurse the next. Others whispered that she had learned secret paths beneath the city, tunnels that allowed her to vanish when soldiers closed in. There were even tales that she could sense danger before it arrived, guided by some invisible instinct that warned her to disappear just moments before a raid. The truth was simpler, but no less remarkable. She was alert, disciplined, and utterly determined. She trusted her instincts, and those instincts rarely betrayed her. Her reputation grew with each escape. The Gestapo increased the reward on her head, offering millions of francs for information that would lead to her capture. It was a sum so vast that many in the city repeated it in disbelief. In a time when food was scarce and money could mean survival, the price on her life tempted many. Yet even with betrayal hanging in the air, she managed to remain untouchable. Some tried to follow her, hoping to trade her life for wealth, but they underestimated her sharp eyes. She noticed shadows where they should not be, footsteps that lingered too long, questions asked with too much interest. Each time she slipped away before the net could close. To the Gestapo, she became a personal insult. They prided themselves on control, on their ability to crush resistance with ruthless precision. Yet one woman, moving through their grasp like water, undermined their authority. Reports described her as dangerous, highly intelligent, capable of organizing sabotage on a large scale. The tone of those documents revealed not just fear, but rage, for men who believed themselves masters of order, being outwitted by a single woman was intolerable. Nancy learned to live with this strange duality. In the daylight, she could walk through the streets, appearing to be an ordinary figure in a dress, carrying a basket, or stopping at a market stall. Inwardly, she knew that her face was on wanted posters, that her image was burned into the minds of those who sought her. Every casual glance from a stranger could be suspicion. Every knock on the door could be betrayal. Yet she carried herself with calm. To survive, she had to embrace the act, to blend into the very fabric of the city that hunted her. The people took courage from her survival. In the markets and on the trams, whispers of the white mouse brought brief sparks of hope. If she could resist, then perhaps victory was still possible. If she could escape from the most feared secret police in the world, then maybe others could too. Her existence became proof that the occupiers were not invincible, that even their power could be mocked by one determined heart. But the legend carried its own burden. The more she was celebrated, the more she was pursued. Nights grew longer, filled with endless vigilance. She could no longer linger in the same safe house for more than a short time. She memorized countless routes, prepared false names, trained her mind to shift identities as easily as changing clothes. The strain was immense. She lived in a constant state of readiness, never truly resting, never certain that the next day would come. And yet she thrived under pressure. The danger sharpened her spirit. The memory of her husband's sacrifice burned in her, pushing her forward when exhaustion threatened to consume her. She refused to let his death be meaningless. Each time she evaded capture, she felt she was honoring his courage, proving that the enemy could not break what he had died to protect. The Gestapo came close many times. Once she was stopped at a checkpoint where soldiers examined documents by the dim light of lanterns. The officer held her papers for a long moment, his eyes studying her face. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her expression remained serene. She spoke calmly, her voice steady, her gaze respectful but unyielding. After a silence that seemed endless, he waved her through. She walked away with measured steps, only allowing herself to breathe when she turned the corner. Moments like that defined her existence, a balance between calm and chaos, where a single slip could mean the end. The white mouse became more than a nickname. It was her second skin, her shield, and her weapon. She wore it with pride, even as it marked her as the most hunted woman in occupied France. She understood that the enemy's fury was proof of her effectiveness. Every bridge she helped destroy, every prisoner she guided to safety, every message she carried across enemy lines reminded them that their control was not absolute. By the time the reward on her head reached some spoken of in millions, her story had already crossed borders. Allied commanders in London knew her name. Resistance fighters across France invoked her as inspiration. Even the enemy, in their private reports, admitted grudging respect for the elusive woman who continued to haunt their operations. Nancy had become both myth and reality, a living embodiment of defiance. For the Gestapo, she was the shadow that slipped from their grasp. For her people, she was proof that one individual, armed with courage and determination, could stand against the might of an empire. The white mouse lived in both worlds, hunted and celebrated, fragile in her humanity, yet unyielding in her will. She knew the danger would only grow. She knew that each day was borrowed time. But she also knew something else. Legends are not easily captured. and she had already chosen her place in history. London in wartime was a city wrapped in fog and urgency. Streets were dimmed by blackout curtains, sirens cut through the nights, and the sky often trembled under the engines of enemy aircraft. Yet, for Nancy, this city became a place of rebirth. She had left behind the ashes of Marseille, the loss of her husband, the legend of the White Mouse, and she now stood on the threshold of something even more perilous. She had been noticed by those who sought men and women willing to risk everything for the greater struggle. The Special Operations Executive was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was not an ordinary military organization, but rather a secret arm, created to weave invisible lines of resistance behind enemy fronts. They were recruiting people who could pass unnoticed, who could lead others, who could blend into the very soil of occupied lands and strike without warning. Nancy, with her experience, her courage, and her unyielding will, was the perfect candidate. Her training began with the basics, but quickly became something more. She learned to handle weapons until they felt like extensions of her own body. She crawled through mud under barbed wire, scaled cliffs with ropes cutting into her hands, and ran mile after mile until her legs burned and her lungs seemed ready to burst. She practiced sending coded messages over radios, memorizing strings of numbers and letters that could mean the difference between life and death. She mastered the art of silence, the patience of waiting, and the discipline of enduring interrogations in simulated conditions meant to prepare her for capture. Instructors were often skeptical at first. Some believed women were not suited for such missions, that the strain would be too great. But Nancy silenced every doubt with performance. She outshot many of her male counterparts, outlasted them in endurance, and never once faltered in spirit. One officer later admitted that he had never seen such a blend of grace and iron. She carried herself with poise even while crawling through dirt, as if dignity itself had become her armor. Beyond the physical tests, there were lessons in disguise. She learned to alter her posture, to change the rhythm of her walk, to shift her accent so smoothly that even trained ears might hesitate. She studied maps of France until every river and mountain range lived in her memory. She rehearsed cover stories, building entire false lives with such detail that she could recount them under pressure. Every detail mattered, for the enemy's questions would be sharp and unrelenting. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her quarters, she often thought of her husband, of the glance he gave her the last time she saw him alive. That memory had become her constant companion, a reminder of why she endured. Grief had hardened into determination, and she told herself that if she survived, she would carry his spirit back into the land that had claimed him. At last, the day came when her training ended and her mission began. She was told that she would be parachuted into central France, into the dark forests and valleys where resistance fighters waited. Her task was to organize, to unify scattered groups, to prepare them for the moment when the Allies would return. It was a mission from which many never returned, but Nancy accepted it without hesitation. She had been walking toward this moment since the day she first carried a letter through the streets of Marseille. The night of the jump was cold and moonless. She boarded the aircraft with a small team, the engines roaring in her ears as the plane climbed into the sky. The cabin was filled with the smell of oil and metal, with the nervous silence of those who knew they were flying into peril. She sat with her parachute strapped tight, her mind calm. her hands steady. Around her, men checked their equipment, whispered prayers, or stared into the dark. Nancy closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She felt no fear. What she felt was a strange clarity, as if every thread of her life had led to this single night. When the green light flashed, she stepped to the door. The wind struck her face like a wave, pulling at her hair and clothes. For a heartbeat, she hovered between worlds, the safety of the plain behind her and the vast unknown below. Then she jumped. The plunge through darkness was both terrifying and liberating. The roar of the plane faded, and there was only the rush of air, the sense of falling into nothing. She counted steadily, pulled the cord, and felt the sudden jerk as the parachute opened above her. The canopy bloomed like a silent flower, and she drifted down through the night sky. Far below, the outlines of fields and forests stretched like a shadowed quilt, dotted with faint lights of distant villages. She landed hard, rolling across the damp earth, quickly gathering the parachute into her arms. The silence was overwhelming. Only the whisper of wind through grass and the beating of her heart filled her ears. She crouched low, listening, scanning the darkness. Then, from the edge of the field, a figure emerged with a signal she recognized. She had arrived. Nancy stood once more on French soil, not as the woman who had once walked the markets of Marseille, not as the grieving widow who had lost everything, but as a soldier of the shadows, armed with training, discipline, and unshakable will. Ahead of her lay either death or glory. She knew the Gestapo still hunted her, that her name remained on their lists, that the reward for her capture had not faded. Yet here she was, returning willingly into their grasp. The leap into the unknown had changed her forever. She was no longer merely the white mouse who escaped. She had become the hunter as well as the hunted, a force sent to ignite the fires of resistance until the land itself would rise. In that silent French field under the cover of night, she embraced her fate fully. The war was not yet won, but she had made her choice. She would fight on the soil she now called her own, and nothing would stop her until the final battle was done. She moved through the hills like someone who had always known the landscape by heart. Valleys, ridges, narrow tracks through chestnut forests, goat paths that locals avoided in daylight because of patrols and in night, because of ghosts of the missing. All of it became part of her map. She built not a map of paper, but a map of memory. Rivers became landmarks. A lonely oak, a guidepost. The crooked stone by a stream, a signpost for those who knew how to read it. In her hands, these details were not mere scenery. They were the thin threads that held whole lives together. Organizing the men and women who joined the Maquis required patience as much as courage. Many arrived raw from farms and villages, unaccustomed to the discipline of clandestine life. Some came with eyes full of simple anger and a hunger for revenge. Others arrived broken, clutching stories of family taken in night raids. She treated them like a leader who could both soothe fear and sharpen resolve. She taught them to move in silence, to ration food without panic, to hide weapons cleverly so that even a sudden inspection might reveal nothing. She listened to their fears and to their anger, and she turned those voices into a single purpose. Under her guidance, fragmented groups became units that could strike and vanish before the enemy understood what had been lost. Sabotage was a craft. It required knowledge of metal, of rail, of timetables and the arrogance of supply chains. To break a line was not merely to smash a rail. It was to study the schedule, to plant a delay at the moment when the convoy most depended upon a bridge or a junction, to ensure that the enemy lost material and confidence as well as time. Bridges must be chosen carefully. Some spanned water that could swallow an entire supply train without a trace. Others were vital for movement between towns. She preferred operations that hit at the nerve of logistics, where a single explosion could ripple through lines of command and force the enemy to reroute and to watch where they had once moved with impunity. There were nights when she climbed into the belly of a supply convoy and felt heat from engines through the soles of her boots. She learned how trains smelled, how their metal sang with tension, how the rails hummed in the dead of night. In one operation, she and a small band slid along a service road beneath the shadow of a railway embankment, carrying charges wrapped in oilcloth. They set the devices with a patience that felt almost religious, each movement measured, each breath a prayer. When the detonation came, it was not only the steel that broke. The sound echoed in the bones of men who counted on iron and order. The train stalled. Soldiers poured out, shaken, seeking the phantom that had robbed them of timetables and certainty. For the people who had been pushed into hunger and silence, the explosion meant weeks of delay in the flow of supplies, a sudden scarcity that gifted food and hope to villages waiting in the dark. Destroying bridges often meant traveling with the dead weight of guilt and necessity. They would arrive under the cover of trees, sometimes after days of guiding frightened refugees to safety, and prepare charges that would take hours to place. She always thought about the people on the other side of that bridge. War made monsters of logistics, but it also made strangers of places. The decision to sever a connection was always tempered by the knowledge that civilians could suffer. Yet the calculus was cruelly simple. A single bridge left intact could allow convoys to roll deep into countryside and crush gatherings of the Maquis. Better to break the route and force the enemy to reroute through narrow passes where ambushes could be set, and where the spirit of resistance could rise. Ambushes on columns were sometimes raw and violent. A sleepy vale would be turned into a theater of conflict. Men and women who had never fired a weapon stood behind earth and stone, their fingers trembling as they waited for the right moment. She taught them how to choose that moment. A well-timed burst at the lead vehicle could stop a column. A sudden flare of smoke could send confusion into the ranks. They learned to use the noise of the countryside to camouflage the first shots, and to make the enemy feel surrounded when in truth only the road lay on either side. After one such ambush, a small team tore through the supplies and took what was necessary. They left a message carved into a wooden post warning that the occupiers would pay in time for every town they terrorized. Her operations were not only about explosions and firefights, they were also about rescue. She led night crossings that guided refugees and downed airmen across mountains and into safe houses. In a world where identity papers could be a sentence, finding a hidden room beneath a farmhouse, a cellar lined with sacks and secret doors, meant life. She organized routes to Spain, taught the route to a shepherd who would carry a child across a ridge, negotiated with local smugglers who hated being told what risk to take, but understood the currency of humanity. Once, a small team carried a wounded pilot through terrain still crawling with patrols. They traveled by starlight and by the hush of sleeping fields, carrying the man like a secret to be guarded against the ears of the earth itself. Reaching safety after such nights felt like a victory carved out of the impossible. There were stories that traveled the countryside and grew like vines. One told of the time when she organized a nocturnal strike on a column that had been burning villages. They stopped the convoy not to kill indiscriminately, but to seize records, to capture files that proved crimes, to deliver evidence to courts waiting across borders. In seizing papers, they created truth. Bringing truth to light was as vital as blowing bridges. Evidence could travel beyond the reach of bullets and be used to register names and crimes in lands where judges still had the courage to listen. She knew the cost of each action. Each explosion, each firefight, each rescue changed the face of the region. Some villages celebrated with secret joy when a convoy stalled. Others paid dearly when reprisals came. Every successful ambush might bring a dawn of gratitude and an evening of dread. She never let triumph drown out sorrow. After operations, she walked among people whose faces had been lit for an hour by a hope of deliverance, and then had to face reprisals that took the bread of their children. She sat with them and listened to their fear and let their grief deepen the resolve to act with greater care. Commanding thousands was not the same as leading a small band. As the Maquis swelled, she found herself balancing the raw passion of young recruits with the weary practicality of veterans. She learned to delegate, to trust those who had proven steady in the dark, to build a network of lieutenants who understood both geography and human temperament. She delegated sabotage details to those who loved mechanics, rescue routes to those with local knowledge, intelligence collecting to the ones who could listen without seeming to hear. Leadership was also about creating a culture where families hid fighters under roofs without telling their children why their fathers were gone at dawn. It was about convincing a bakery to give a crust to a messenger and to shut its door quickly when patrols passed. And yet, for all of the planning, there remained the element of improvisation. War demanded that the plan be abandoned at the first hint of a trap and the instinct take over. She learned to trust the instincts that had kept her alive in Marseille. Those instincts taught her to read silence and irregularity. Often the sign of danger was not the footstep, but the absence of sound, where sound should be. One night, she aborted an operation because the frogs at a stream had stopped singing. That pause told her that something unnatural filled the air, and they moved away to fight another day. Her name spread, as did the stories of daring deeds. Villagers carved symbols on doorposts to mark safe houses. Passing glances became signals of gathering, and a hidden flag hung for a night before being stored away. Children learned to call her name like a talisman. The enemy tried to stamp out the network, but the very fabric of life in the region had altered. What had once been a string of separate homesteads became a mesh of hidden trails and whispered offers. That mesh survived by the bravery of ordinary people who chose to risk small acts of defiance. Blood was shed. There were nights when she walked through villages and counted the missing. Every death marked her with a quiet sorrow that did not ease. She carried letters from fallen fighters back to their families and watched as hands trembled over ink that had once been vibrant with life. She learned to hold grief in a place that allowed action. The heartbreak did not diminish her doing. It sharpened her. It turned each loss into a lesson, each failed mission into a blueprint of what must be done differently. In the end, the war in the shadows was a mosaic of countless small acts. A broken rail here, a captured document there, a rescued pilot, and a sabotaged bridge, each piece placed by hands that trembled and by hearts that refused to give in. She became master of this mosaic, shaping it not for glory, but for endurance. Through patience and daring, she taught the land to fight back, to slow the iron appetite of the occupiers, and in those slowings find moments where hope could be refueled. The Marquise survived because someone could organize fear into action and sorrow into purpose. She led that conversion with a steel that carried the memory of the dead and the stubborn belief that a people denied their future could still rise to claim it. The order came without time for argument. A message had to be delivered across a distance that seemed impossible, through valleys and ridges, across roads guarded by patrols and villages watched with suspicion. The radio link had failed. Other couriers were missing, and the plan that could change the fate of whole units of resistance fighters depended on a single act. Nancy volunteered without hesitation. She knew what it meant. To carry words over 500 kilometers on foot in only 3 days was to test the edge of human endurance. Yet she accepted because she had already promised herself that nothing would ever stop her as long as she still had breath. The march began before dawn. A chill clung to the fields, and mist wrapped the trees like gauze. She carried little, a flask of water, a crust of bread, and the paper sealed within her clothing. Every gram of weight mattered, for she knew her body would have to carry not only her own bones, but the destiny of others. She walked with a steady rhythm, her boots striking the earth with the certainty of a drumbeat. She measured her pace by her breathing, long inhales that filled her lungs, long exhales that steadied her mind. As the sun rose, the first hills loomed. Trails wound like snakes, rough and unforgiving. She climbed without pause, her legs burning, her chest heaving. The sweat soaked through her shirt, chilling her skin as the wind picked up. But she forced herself onward. She told herself that each step was not for her, but for those who waited. Each step carried food to the hungry, ammunition to the fighters, hope to those who hid in cellars and prayed for deliverance. By nightfall of the first day she had crossed villages where shutters closed at the sound of footsteps, where dogs barked but no voices answered. She drank from streams, scooped water with trembling hands, and pressed forward. Her stomach growled with emptiness, but she ignored it. Pain became her companion. Blisters rose on her feet, sharp as knives with each step, but she did not slow. When exhaustion threatened to break her, she thought of her husband's final glance, of comrades lost in ambushes, of the children she had seen clutching their mothers in fear. Those memories became fuel, bitter but strong. The second day was worse. Muscles stiffened, knees screamed, and the weight of her body seemed too heavy for her legs. She staggered more than once, catching herself on stones, her palms scraped raw. Hunger gnawed at her until she felt hollow, as if she were only skin stretched over will. Villages passed in a blur. She dared not linger, dared not trust even a friendly face, for betrayal could be bought with the reward that the enemy still offered for her capture. So she walked alone, a phantom with a mission, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The mountains rose higher, their peaks covered in mist. Paths twisted upward, cruel and narrow. She climbed with her body bent forward, hands pressed against her thighs for strength. Each breath burned, each step felt like the last. Yet she never stopped. She repeated words to herself like a mantra, one more step, one more hill, one more hour. She no longer thought of the distance ahead, but only of the ground beneath her boots, each piece of earth conquered and left behind. Night brought its own terror. The cold cut through her thin clothing, and fatigue threatened to drag her into the soil. More than once she felt her eyes closing as she walked, her body desperate for sleep. But she forced herself awake, biting her tongue until she tasted blood, whispering to herself, slapping her arms to stir life into them. She leaned on memories, on the faces of those who depended on her, on the belief that her suffering was nothing compared to theirs. On the third day, she reached the edge of delirium. The landscape swam before her eyes. Roads seemed endless. Hills stretched like cruel illusions. Her feet were torn and bleeding, every step agony. She walked as if her body had ceased to belong to her, as if only her spirit carried her forward. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull emptiness that hollowed her from within. She chewed on leaves, drank rainwater from puddles, anything to keep moving. Yet through that haze came clarity. She realized that she had become nothing but will. The flesh might fail, the bones might crack, but the will remained unbroken. She remembered the oath she had made in silence after her husband's death, the promise that she would fight until there was no breath left. That promise carried her when strength failed. At last, as the third day waned, she staggered into the safe house where the message had to be delivered. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, her boots torn, her face hollow with exhaustion. She collapsed onto a bench, her hands trembling as she pulled the paper from her clothing. She placed it in the hands of the contact, her lips forming only a few words. "It is done." The room fell silent. The fighters who received the message understood what it meant, what it had cost. Because of her march, convoys would be redirected, ambushes prepared, lives saved. 500 kilometers in 72 hours, a feat that seemed impossible, had been conquered by a single woman driven by grief, duty, and unyielding will. Afterward she slept for a day and a night without stirring. Her body lay broken, but when she awoke, she was ready again. For in the war she had chosen, there was no luxury of rest. Each mission bled into the next. And though she never spoke often of that march, those who heard the story carried it like a legend. The white mouse, the woman who could outrun hunger and pain, had once more outwitted the limits of flesh. It was proof that resistance was not measured only by bullets or bombs. Sometimes resistance was measured in footsteps, in the sheer stubbornness of a heart that refused to stop beating, in the sound of boots striking the earth hour after hour until the impossible was done. Nancy had shown them that, and because she endured, others believed they too could endure. In the mountains and forests of central France, the Maquis grew into an army. At first, they were scattered bands, rough and uncertain, men who carried old rifles and stolen pistols, young boys with barely any training, farmers who left their plows behind to take up arms. They had passion and anger, but little discipline. Nancy saw in them not just rebels, but the seeds of a force that could shake an empire. She took on the role of leader, not by demanding it, but by embodying it. Step by step, she became the center around which thousands gathered. It surprised many at first. She was a woman among men hardened by labor and war, men who were used to following male officers, men who believed leadership belonged to the strongest arm or the loudest voice. Yet when Nancy spoke, even the most skeptical listened. Her words were clear, her tone firm, her logic undeniable. She did not waste breath on empty promises. She explained the plan, laid out the risks, and showed the path to survival. Slowly they began to trust her, not because she demanded obedience, but because she earned it with every decision. She organized camps in the hills with a precision that astonished those who had never known order. Food was rationed carefully, weapons distributed with thought, guards set at proper intervals. She insisted on discipline, on silence during marches, on readiness at all times. Her fighters grumbled at first, but soon they saw the results. Raids became sharper, escapes cleaner, survival more certain. They realized she carried a mind trained like a blade, one that cut through confusion and found the most direct solution. Her courage was not the loud kind. She did not shout or pound the table. She showed courage by walking at the front of columns, by entering villages under occupation to scout the terrain herself, by staying calm when bullets flew. Men who might have dismissed her because of her gender began to follow her with loyalty stronger than iron. They said to themselves that if she could walk into fire without trembling, then they could do no less. There were moments when her leadership revealed itself in stark clarity. Once, when enemy troops surrounded a valley, panic threatened to scatter the fighters. Nancy stood before them, her face calm, her voice even. She gave orders for a retreat through a narrow pass, assigning groups to cover the withdrawal. Her plan saved the unit from destruction. Later, the men whispered among themselves that her nerve had held steady while their own had nearly broken. Another time, during a sabotage mission, explosives failed to detonate. Without hesitation, she crawled back under enemy eyes to reset the charges, emerging with dust and sweat on her skin, her expression cold with focus. The bridge collapsed minutes later, and the fighters saw in her not only a strategist, but a warrior. Her authority rested not only on deeds of daring, but also on empathy. She knew her men by name. She sat with them at fires, listened to their stories of wives and children, spoke gently to those who trembled after their first ambush. She reminded them why they fought, not only for France, but for the dignity of every human soul under occupation. In her presence, they felt both cared for and commanded. She gave them strength by making them feel they mattered. As the Maquis swelled, numbers reached thousands. Whole regions came under her influence. Supplies were scarce, weapons uneven, but morale grew strong. She drilled them not as an army of polished uniforms, but as an army of shadows. She taught them to use terrain, to strike at weak points, to vanish when overmatched. She insisted on discipline in victory, forbidding unnecessary cruelty. She told them that every act of resistance was also a message to the people, a proof that freedom could be defended with honor. Men twice her age deferred to her judgment. Young fighters looked at her with awe. They began to call her not just the White Mouse, but commander, leader, even mother, though the word was spoken with respect rather than sentiment. She carried the weight of their trust like armor. When disagreements broke out, she mediated with a cool mind. When tempers flared, She cut through the noise with simple truth. She never needed to raise her voice. Her authority came from the certainty that radiated from her presence. Her fearlessness became legend. In battles, she moved calmly through gunfire, her orders precise, her demeanor steady. Once, when an enemy column advanced on their position, she walked openly among her fighters, encouraging each man, touching shoulders, meeting eyes. She said nothing dramatic. She simply stood with them unshaken. And in that quiet fearlessness, they found the will to hold their ground. The ambush that followed broke the enemy line and sent survivors fleeing. Fighters would later say that they had held not because of rifles or explosives, but because they refused to let her down. Nancy knew the weight of command. She carried the grief of each death, each failed mission. She wrote letters to families when she could, explaining with honesty, offering comfort. She reminded her men that loss was part of war, but that despair could never be allowed to poison the cause. She turned mourning into determination, reminding them that each fallen comrade demanded that they fight harder, smarter, longer. By the time Allied forces prepared to return to France, Nancy Wake had become more than a symbol. She was the living core of an army of thousands who trusted her with their lives. Her leadership was a paradox. A woman in a world of men, gentle in word, yet ruthless in resolve, empathetic in heart, yet coldly logical in decision. That paradox gave her power. It allowed her to bridge divides, to inspire the weak, to steady the strong, to lead where others faltered. The White Mouse, once a whisperer in the streets of Marseille, was now a commander in the forest of France. She commanded not by title, but by spirit, not by rank, but by the undeniable truth that she was the one who never bent, never broke, never let fear decide her path. Thousands followed because they saw in her not only the leader they needed, but the future they longed for. And under her command, the Maquis transformed from scattered rebels into a force that shook the very foundations of the occupation. The summer of liberation swept across France like a storm long awaited. Allied armies moved inland after the landings, and the Maquis rose from forests and villages to strike in coordination. For Nancy, the months that followed were a blur of fire and victory, of long-prepared plans unfolding, of bridges collapsing under charges set weeks before, of convoys ambushed with precision that made soldiers whisper in disbelief. At last, the day came when enemy banners were lowered and foreign boots began their retreat. The air that had carried the weight of fear now carried the sounds of bells and voices lifted in joy. In towns where silence had ruled for years, people poured into the streets waving flags hidden in attics, flags that had been folded with trembling hands in darker times. Women embraced strangers. Men shouted with tears running down their faces. Children ran with wild laughter. Nancy moved through these crowds with a strange calm. She saw joy in every gesture, yet inside her heart was heavy. For every face she met, she remembered another face she would never see again. Comrades who had not survived the long years of shadow war stood beside her only in memory. The Allied commanders who entered France knew her name. Reports had reached London, stories had spread through resistance channels, and when soldiers finally met the woman they had heard of as the White Mouse, many looked with awe. Medals followed, ceremonies where ribbons were pinned to her chest, where generals spoke of courage and nations expressed gratitude. She accepted them with dignity, but without pride. To her the true honors belonged to those who had fallen in ditches and cellars, those whose names would never be carved on grand plaques. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre more than once. The British bestowed the George Medal. The Americans honored her with the Medal of Freedom. Each award came with speeches of valor, yet each time she held the medal in her hand, she felt the echo of loss. No medal could replace her husband, taken by the Gestapo in the early years. No ribbon could fill the silence left by comrades whose laughter she still heard in dreams. After the liberation, she walked again through Marseille, through streets where she had once carried messages with trembling hands. Now the shutters were open, the markets alive again, the air free of marching boots. Yet every corner whispered to her. She saw the door where soldiers had once dragged a neighbor away. She saw the square where she had slipped through patrols. Liberation brought light, but light also revealed the scars. People called her heroine, savior, commander. They told her she was a legend. She listened quietly, but inside she remained the same woman who had once stepped onto a dark road with a letter hidden in her clothing, heart pounding, uncertain if she would live another hour. Heroism to her was not glory. It was duty performed when there was no other choice. Triumph and grief walked hand in hand. At night she sat alone and felt the ache of absence. She remembered the man who had been her partner, the one who had believed in her strength even before she had known it herself. She remembered the men she had led, the young ones whose eyes had shone with reckless hope, the older ones who had fought with weary determination. She carried them all, a silent procession that followed her wherever she went. Yet she never allowed grief to crush her. She believed that the only way to honor the dead was to live with purpose. She attended ceremonies, she gave interviews, she wrote letters of remembrance. She spoke the names of those forgotten so that their memory would not fade. She told their stories not with bitterness, but with quiet pride. When asked how she survived, she gave simple answers: discipline, determination, the refusal to yield. She never painted herself as extraordinary. She insisted that she had only done what had to be done. But those who listened knew they were hearing the voice of someone who had carried entire regions on her shoulders, someone who had defied an empire with nothing but will and courage. The war ended, yet for Nancy it never truly ended. It lived within her as memory and as burden. She knew victory had come at a terrible price. She had helped free a nation, but freedom was written in blood. She walked among celebrations with steady steps, but behind her eyes lived the shadows of the fallen. The triumph of liberation belonged to all who resisted. Nancy Wake, the white mouse, became its emblem. She was saluted, decorated, embraced by nations. Yet when she looked inward, she did not see medals or ceremonies. She saw the faces of those who had paid the final price. Her greatest victory was not that she had survived, but that she had carried their spirit into the light of freedom. When the guns fell silent and France was free, Nancy faced the strange silence of peace. For years she had lived by the rhythm of danger, the constant vigilance of survival, the knowledge that each dawn might be her last. Now she awoke to quiet streets, to the murmur of rebuilding, to the sound of life returning. The transition was not simple. For those who had lived in shadows, daylight could feel unnatural. Yet she embraced it with the same resolve that had carried her through the war. Her name traveled across oceans. She received medals not only from France, but also from Britain and America. Ceremonies filled her life for a time, halls where officials spoke of sacrifice and banners waved. She stood in uniforms and in dresses, listening to speeches that called her heroine. She accepted the honors with grace, but also with a certain distance. She knew that no ribbon could balance the weight of the graves that lined her memory. Still, she carried the medals home, not as trophies, but as symbols of all who had not lived to see them. In the years that followed, she turned her energy to new battles. She entered politics, standing before assemblies and crowds, speaking of freedom not as an abstract dream, but as a reality she had fought to defend. She believed that women had a voice that could shape nations, and she used hers without hesitation. Though political life was harsh and victories elusive, she walked into it with the same courage that had carried her across the mountains of France. Even when defeated, she never surrendered her convictions. Life after war was marked by restless movement. She lived in France, in Britain, in Australia, crossing continents as if she could never remain in one place for too long. In each land, she left impressions of strength and resilience. Journalists sought her, writers recorded her stories, veterans embraced her as one of their own. She spoke of the war when asked, though often with restraint. She did not glorify. She told of hunger, of fear, of comradeship, of loss. She reminded listeners that victory was built on countless small acts of courage, many of them unseen and unrecorded. As years turned to decades, the world changed. The Europe she had known under occupation became a different place, rebuilt and modern. Yet her story endured. Young people who had never seen war listened with wide eyes to the tales of the White Mouse. Schools invited her, veterans groups honored her, governments remembered her in anniversaries. She became a bridge between generations, proof that one person could stand against tyranny and endure. Age did not dim her spirit. Her hair turned white, her body slowed, but her mind remained sharp, her humor intact. She could laugh at her own legend, recalling with a twinkle in her eye the absurdities of espionage, the strange disguises, the close escapes. But behind the laughter lived the steel that had never broken. Even in old age, she walked with the dignity of one who had faced the worst and refused to bow. She outlived many who had walked beside her. The loss weighed heavy, yet she carried it with quiet acceptance. She often said that fate had spared her for a reason, though she never claimed to know what that reason was. Perhaps it was simply to remind the living of what had been endured and what had been won. She became a living monument, not carved in stone, but written in flesh and memory, a woman who embodied resistance. In the final years of her life, she was recognized as one of the most decorated women of the Second World War. The medals, the titles, the ceremonies all testified to her achievements. Yet those who knew her understood that her greatest strength was not in honors, but in character. She had been tested by cruelty, by grief, by exhaustion, and had emerged unbroken. Nancy Wake lived long enough to see her story recorded in books and films, to watch as generations who had never heard the roar of bombers came to know her name. She lived to be celebrated not just as the White Mouse, the elusive agent, but as Nancy, the woman who had loved, lost, fought, and endured. Her legend survived the era because it was built not only on war, but on will. She proved that courage could come in the form of a woman from the far side of the world, a woman who chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible. Neither the Nazis, nor betrayal, nor personal tragedy could break her. She remained until the end a symbol of resilience, a reminder that history is shaped not only by armies and leaders, but by individuals who refuse to yield. When she passed, tributes poured from across the world. Leaders and veterans, citizens and strangers spoke her name with reverence. Yet perhaps the most fitting memory was found in the simple words of those she had once saved, those who remembered her not as a figure of legend, but as a woman who appeared in their darkest hour and showed them that hope still lived. The White Mouse had become a story for the ages, but Nancy Wake remained a woman of flesh and blood who had carried the unbearable and kept walking. That, more than medals or titles, was why she survived as a legend long after her time had passed.